Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on open accessibility, collaborating with editors to ensure accessible content. I am Josh Cromwell. I'm Scholarly Communications Manager at the University of Southern Mississippi. And as part of that role, I oversee our journal publishing program, which we do through our IR, among many of the other hats that I wear. But that's going to be the one that's most relevant to what I want to talk to you about today. Just to give you a little roadmap on where we're headed, I'll start with a little introduction. You've kind of already heard that. You've heard who I am, kind of what I do. Then we'll talk a little bit about our publishing program, how we got started, and sort of how that plays into what I'm going to talk to you about today. Then the big question that we encountered, the plan we developed to address that question, and then sort of the way forward, what we're going to do going forward to fully develop that plan and bring it into fruition. So again, introduction, I mentioned who I am, what I do. I will just go ahead and briefly address the fact that obviously these sorts of presentations are a little challenging, and obviously we wish we could be together in person, but I'm thankful for the organizers for providing us with this option, and hopefully with vaccines widely available, hopefully it'll be safe again for us all to gather soon, and I think we're all looking forward to that. So I mentioned that I would start with a little overview of our publishing program. So we publish through our IR, our institutional repository, which is Aquila, named for the constellation of the eagle, because the university's mascot is the golden eagle. So that's the reason behind the name. We launched that in January of 2012. And actually, our publishing initiative started pretty quickly after that. The first journal that we published was SLIS Connecting, the School of Library and Information Science on campus, came to us right after the launch of the IR, because one of the qualifications for accreditation for them is to develop some sort of means of communicating with alumni, with other elements of the program. And so they were looking at creating a newsletter to do that. So they came to us and asked if Aquila would be a means for doing that. And so we walked them through all of the publishing tools that we had built in within the system. I should probably add here that we were built on the Digital Commons platform. That's the platform that we use. So we walked them through that, and then they decided, well, given the journal tools here, what if we just built this out into a full-fledged journal? And so that's what they did. They have sort of two sections to it. The one kind of meets those accreditation requirements, kind of functions more in newsletter style. And then the other part is actual research articles in library and information science. The next title that came a few months after that was at that time, the Online Journal of Health Ethics. They're now just the Journal of Health Ethics. They did exist already. They had a website that their editor was maintaining, where she was just posting the articles there basically. But then they ended up moving to Aquila because, for one thing, the libraries were offsetting the cost. We were the ones paying for the platform. And two, the tools we had for peer review, that sort of thing, that they could do all within the system, just made it much easier for them. Now, at this point today, we're up to 7 titles altogether. You see a little smattering of the cover images here. There's an old issue of at that time, Online Journal of Health Ethics. The primary source, which is published by, is a publication of the Society of Mississippi Archivists. There's a SLIS Connecting cover, and that last one you see there is Coastlines, which is actually a student poetry journal that's published at our Gulf Coast campus. So you see we've got a pretty diverse selection of titles there. We've got some student research, we've got some, one international journal, in fact, an international education journal. But so a pretty wide array of titles, and we're obviously hoping to expand and attract even more. But so now I mentioned that within all this, and it's exciting to have all of these opportunities to publish these journal titles. But the big question that came to our mind as we move forward is, are these journals open? Well, on the one hand, sure, because I mean, we do with all of our journals, they are at least partially, if not fully, open in terms of open access, in terms of anyone can access the articles. So yes, they are in that regard. But on the other hand, just because someone can access the files, does that mean they can access that content? Well, not necessarily. So yes, they're open, but no, they're not, because does open mean accessible? And if it doesn't, I would argue, shouldn't it? Because it's one thing to be able to actually download a PDF file of an article or whatever format it's in. It's one thing to actually access that file. But if you can't read it, if you can't use the material that's in that file, is it really accessible? And so if we're approaching the question from that framework, from that standpoint, we kind of had to say, well, they're not really open, because not all of the articles that we have are meeting all of those accessibility benchmarks. So this, of course, led to a couple of related questions, which is, number one, who's responsible for accessibility? Who is it that's going to take the lead in that? Are we taking the lead in that as the libraries, or should that be the responsibility of the individual editors? And then secondly, what training is needed? What do we need to do on our end, or what do we need to provide to editors to ensure that we have the skill set needed to make that content accessible? So after we sort of laid out those questions, the next step, of course, was to build a plan, to develop a plan of action to address all of that. And so what we decided to do, first of all, was just make that simple determination of, okay, who's doing what? What's the breakdown of responsibilities? What we ultimately decided to do, just based on the really more practical considerations than anything, was that the libraries would identify issues. So we would be the ones to kind of look at some of the existing articles, determine what needs to be addressed for accessibility standards, and then provide training to editors or to staff personnel, whoever it might be, with those journals to address those things going forward. And so then the editors would be the ones making the changes on their end. Obviously, in a perfect world, I wish we were doing that in-house, because I sort of feel like that ideally that's a service that a publisher should be able to provide. But given that we are just sort of an in-house library publisher with several titles, plus all the other hats that we wear in our roles, so there's only myself and one other staff member handling all IR/Scalcom responsibilities at our institution, then it just was not practical for us to be able to do all of that ourselves with all the other things we had to do. So the only real way to make this happen was for us to train editors and have them either take that responsibility themselves or assign it to someone associated with the journal to do that work. So once we'd sort of delineated the duties, the next step became identifying the actual challenges. What are the things that we actually need to change in order to be in compliance? So what we did was we looked for some of the common errors. And the way that I did this was I took 5 articles from the issues of each of our journals that did publish an issue last year. Some, of course, did not, because of the pandemic. That created some challenges. And so some of our journals didn't publish issues last year, but most did. And so what I did, I grabbed 5 of the articles, just sort of at random, but I did kind of pick different categories, if that makes sense. So some that were standard articles, some that were more reviews, that kind of thing. And then what I did was I just looked for some frequent errors. What were the things that kept showing up? The screenshot you see here is an example of one of the error or the accessibility reports from Acrobat. So I just ran the check for there, for example, and you can see some of the issues that were identified. Some of the common ones that I came across, reading order was probably the most frequent one. And you'll notice in the Acrobat checker there, you have to manually check that. That will automatically catch that, but it will show you sort of the order, and you can look at that. Because typically, especially if you're using text boxes, then those don't get picked up. And so if you're using a screen reader, for example, it doesn't read things in the correct order. It doesn't know that. So you have to actually set that up and make sure that's working correctly. Section headings, this is another common one. So screen readers will look for a hierarchical heading setting. So if your first header is a level 1 heading and your next one's a level 4, the screen reader gets confused. It doesn't know how to handle that. And so it's not going to work properly. So that's a common error we came across. And then the last one, alt text. Most journals do a pretty good job of this. They have captions or descriptions on images or charts, but a few don't, or maybe even if it's a chart, the data in the chart itself might not be fully accessible. So after that, what are our next steps? Well, once we've identified these issues, the next step will be training. And that's really where we're up to at this point. Our goal is to target that training for this summer. We kind of use this term to kind of identify the issues, and with some faculty usually having lighter teaching loads over the summer, this is a good time to kind of sit down with some of them and do the necessary training to get through that next step of the process. We're starting with Gulf and Caribbean research. They're just a good journal to start with because they have probably the best infrastructure. They actually have someone who specifically focuses just on their design. So this would be someone who would be able to dedicate the time to that the other journals may not have. And by doing that, that gives us a good illustration of what we need to change, what we need to correct for going forward with the other journals that don't have the same level of staffing. The initial focus will start with new articles. So because it's easier to address things with new stuff than it is to go back and address back content. That's just a harder process, and there's a lot of it. So we'll start with the new stuff, then kind of focus on a way to deal with back files. And then we'll look at how that training goes, how the process works for them, sort of our best case scenario, and see what we need to change as we roll it out to other journals. So what does the way forward look like with this model laid out? Well, like I mentioned, we're kind of focusing first on the incoming stuff, the new content. We still have to do something about those back files, right? And so what does that look like? Are we doing that as an on-demand thing? Are we sort of just tackling it little by little as we go? Is it worth trying to find a grant or some other program to fund a position or some person to tackle that? That's one of the questions we're having to address. Is there basis for just having in-house support for this? Can we justify a staff position that could deal with accessibility issues, not just for the IR, but just for the libraries as a whole? Might that be a possibility? And then the workflow itself. Does this training, does this model we've laid out, does it work? If it does, are there things we could do to make it better? And if it doesn't, what do we need to change that would make it work? So I think you see here what we've sketched out, or what I've sort of laid out for you, is sort of a pilot really of what we're planning to do and kind of where we are. We're still in that process. My hope is this all goes really great, and so maybe next year I'm reporting back to you about how this all worked out. But we will see, I guess. But so at this point, I will throw over to you for any questions or for any ideas of what you're doing at your own institutions, things that we might want to consider tweaking just as we're still developing and rolling out our program. Thanks again for your time.